Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'm going to continue the series on the Dutch defense with a very interesting attacking option for white. The move bishop g5 as a response to the Dutch, which is known as the Hopton Attack. Now, this move is very tricky, and when I started studying the Dutch, after having covered my responses to the gambits, e4 and g4, I started focusing on this move, and I'm going to be covering it from white's perspective because I truly believe that it's a great attacking option, and even if black knows, theory, it's very hard to play against. So I'll present it as a great anti-Dutch move. Before we get into the opening, I should just mention that the Hopton attack can be played after the normal Dutch d4, f5. You play bishop g5. If white starts with the move d4 pawn to e6, then you can no longer play the Hopton attack, whatever happens, because the queen covers the g5 square. Of course, the downside is that black is going to have to be prepared to play against the French after e4, but that's if you play the French and the Dutch, then e6 avoids most anti-Dutch lines. But after d4 f5, the Hopton attack works. Okay, now let's talk about what this move does. So before you strike at the center with e4, which you would generally like to do against most Dutch systems, you sort of restrict black's options. Black's usual square for the g8 knight is f6. Now, playing the knight out to f6 immediately can be played, and it had been played, but it's simply hard for black to equalize after that because his pawn structure is slightly compromised, as well as his king safety, and his attacking chances are quite reduced because the queen is hardly able to infiltrate the king side after, let's say, e takes f6. And also the knight, which is usually on f6, is unable to come to the g4 square, for example. It's also unable to challenge the e4 square. Therefore, if knight f6 is played immediately, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, e takes f6, it's much harder for black to challenge e4. Also, white can simply play the move pawn to e3. His bishop is no longer on c1, and this now makes sense. After something like d5, c4, you can see that white's pawn structure is perfect, black's pawn structure is compromised, black has pawn weaknesses. Okay, pawn weaknesses, white has the h5 square, he is already breaking through the center, and the development is quite sensible. You play knight f3, you play bishop d3, you play knight c3, rook c1, queen c2, for example. Very normal development, very easy development. You could also consider g3, bishop g2. Therefore, after the Hopton attack, it's very hard to play a normal developing move. So black has to play a compromise. The first thing I would like to mention, if black starts with a move pawn to e6, trying to avoid the Hopton attack, then you cannot enter Leningrad positions with g6, bishop g7, f5, because you've already played e6. After d4, f5, bishop g5, it's very hard to play classical positions. So it's really hard to play e6. So basically the Hopton attack is a great weapon against players who usually don't play the Leningrad Dutch, because you're basically forced to play a Leningrad setup or a weird semi-stone wall stuff. It's very hard to play the classical. So let's, before we move on to the two main moves, h6 and g6, let's just have a look at the sidelines, which are, some of them are okay, some of them are simply bad. So knight f6 is sort of okay, but easier to play for white. c5 is a move I would like to discard immediately. It has been played on pretty high levels, so Bosiocic Marin, one of the strongest Croatian players, faced this against a 2300 player and won easily. All the games in the database, when white is a high-rated player, are simply white wins. So how do you win against c5? So you take, black of course recaptures his pawn with queen a5, you play knight c3, queen takes c5, and now the key move, e4. So a combination of the Hopton Attack and the Staunton Gambit, of course you're trying to rid black of his central control that the f5 pawn provides, and, well, leave him with all the weaknesses he's just created by moving the f pawn and also by moving the c pawn. So this knight could be coming into d5, b5 looking at c7, the queen could come to h5. If this pawn moves, then the bishop gets into the game. So after fe4, because there's no better option, knight e4, queen b4 check, seemingly getting a pawn, but if that pawn is taken, then black is basically losing by force after bishop to d2. His development doesn't exist, his queen is awkwardly placed, let's say queen a3, just continue queen h5 check, g6, queen e5, and everything is collapsing. After queen e5, you could defend with knight f6, but then knight to b5, and, well, you can see that the position is simply dreadful. Queen f4 and next move knight c7 is coming. So c5 is basically unplayable. You might not lose, but it's very hard not to lose. Another move I would say is bad for black is d5 straight away. This just creates too many weaknesses. White continues sensibly with pawn to e3. Black tries to play the stone wall, but now c4 straight away. Queen b6, that's fine, we play queen c2. e6, black tries to play the stone wall, but we are too quick. Knight c3, knight d7, and it's very hard for black to play a normal stone wall when white has already placed his bishop on a perfect square, when white is so quick in controlling the center, and when white is for choice, basically. So d5 I would also discard. c6 is a sensible move. The idea behind c6 is to simply use the fact that white has vacated the c1 square and that the b2 pawn is undefended, but that's not hard to meet. This is, I would say, a one move trick or one trick with c6. Don't be worried if you see this on the board. The idea is not to go for a stone wall, the idea is to attack b2, so after e3, queen to b6, you can simply continue b3. You really don't mind this. After g6, knight d2, and you're playing for c4. Huge center, no weaknesses, great position. So the two moves that we are going to be focusing on are h6 and g6. h6 is the most straightforward way to punish the bishop for coming out so quickly, and g6 is, I would say, the main line, and also the best move, simply going for a Leningrad Dutch setup and asking white, well, why is your bishop on g5? So if I'm playing black here, I'm playing g6. Let's start with h6 first. Okay, so after d4 f5, bishop g5, h6, there are a couple of options for white after bishop h4 and g5. One thing that you should note is that white is not losing the bishop. The reason that white is not losing the bishop is because he can simply either move his bishop away or move his e-pawn and threaten checkmate. So for example, the most aggressive move is pawn to e4. If black should now take the bishop, then queen h5 is checkmate. This diagonal and this weakness of having moved the f7 pawn is key. So after g5, white has three ways to save his position. We are going to have a look at e3, e4, and bishop to g3. Bishop g3 and e3 are mostly going to transpose into very similar or identical positions, and e4 is slightly more risky, so let's have a look at that first. After e4, black has three actually sensible moves. He can play rook h7, bishop g7, or knight f6. After rook h7, the idea is to defend the f7 square. I would say this is easy for white to not to beat, but to prove an advantage against. You play queen h5 check, and after rook f7, you simply give up the bishop. Don't be afraid to sacrifice material in the Hopton attack. It's an aggressive opening which tries to use the weakness of f5 straight away, and tries to use quick development. So just take bishop g5, hg5, and now knight f3. And what's going on in this position is that you want to take on g5, or you want to play knight e5, and you want to combine that with bishop c4, using the spin, winning the rook, and checkmating. So for example, knight f6, queen to g6. You pin the rook, and there are several ways for black to get out of this mess. none of them are really nice. Okay, for example, knight f6 could be played, or you could play e6 for queen f6. So it's not easy to defend. So rook h7 I doubt you'll be seeing, but if it does happen, just queen h5, give up the bishop and try to win on f7. As I said, taking the bishop loses straight away, so that we don't have to cover again. The main move is knight f6. The sideline is bishop to g7. Bishop g7 gives the king the f8 square, so now your bishop actually is threatened. So if for example, you play you play knight c3, they take the bishop, you play queen h5 thinking it's checkmate, well, it's not, king f8. So after bishop g7, you retreat the bishop. We are going to have a look at two key moves. One of them is f4, one of them is f takes e. Let's have a look at f takes e first. After f takes e, this is a standard undermining maneuver with which you punish h6, g5. So whenever your opponent plays h6 against the Hopton attack, remember that your first and foremost plan is to play h4 and break through this structure. Here it's already hard to play black in my opinion. This bishop on g3 is a great piece. The other bishop could come to c4, your queen could still come to h5, and I think it's hard to defend for black. The usual way to undermine white center is c5, and the antidote for that is bishop to e5, and after this exchange happens, I mean, black is not much worse, but his pawn structure is simply ridiculous. After knight c3, again, taking on b2 is not smart. On b2 is not smart. But let's say c5 is not played. Let's say knight f6, which is a normal move. Then you exchange hg, you take the rook, bishop takes rook, and now we continue queen to d2, looking at the g5 pawn, which has to advance, or something like d5 has to be played, and then you continue knight c3, castles queenside, bishop to c4, knight h3, knight f4, knight g6, and you try to checkmate. You can see that this king is not castling queenside anytime soon, and if it goes kingside somewhere to hide, well then it's going to be in huge trouble fairly quickly. So after e4, I wouldn't recommend bishop g7. Knight f6 seems to be a more sensible response. And now, of course, you don't have a way to save your bishop. If you play bishop g3, then I play f4 as black, and you lose because you don't have queen h5 anymore. So you have to play tricky moves, e5. And this is the reason why I wouldn't recommend e4. This is why I prefer e3 or bishop g3. After e5, black plays e6. You take on f6, queen takes on f6. Remember, your bishop is still trapped. So after bishop g3, f4, queen h5 check, king d8, fine, you have misplaced the king. But after something like knight c3 and bishop b4, I think this structure provides a lot of security. The queen is outside, the bishop could be coming to b7, the knight comes to c6, your d4 pawn is weak. I simply don't like this. That's why I wouldn't recommend e4, but if you want to play the trickiest positions possible, then fine, go for e4. e3 and bishop g3 we are going to cover at once because they will be transposing. There are two ways for black to play bishop g7 or knight f6. Mostly black is going to play bishop g7 anyway, but he doesn't have to, so let's have a quick look at bishop g7. After bishop g7 you play bishop g3, you save your bishop. And now the idea behind bishop g7 is to strike at the center with c5. And here you play a sort of London system in which the bishop has already retreated to g3, you play c3. And after queen b6, you can continue knight f3, just ignoring that. You can try to defend with queen b3, which is also fine. I think queen b3 is what I would play. Let's see what the engine prefers actually. The engine likes knight a3 or queen b3. So queen b3 is a sensible way to play, and after something like cd4, queen takes b3, a takes b3, this activity should be quite nice, and again I prefer white. So that's bishop g7. And after knight f6, which is the main move, again you save your bishop. Black continues d6, and here is a black maneuver which you have to remember, black wants to play d6, bishop e6, bishop f7. That covers all the key squares, so you have to react quickly. If you play something slow now, then black could have enough time to develop. Not that bishop d3 or knight c3 or knight d2 are not good moves, or bishop c4, but you have to play quickly, so you continue h4. And this forces black to react. If bishop g7, then again you trade and his position is wrecked. If bishop e6 now, then you simply win a pawn because the pawn is pinned to the rook. So after h4, black has to react g4. Now this gives you some very interesting options, and I'll try to explain the point behind h4 very early on in the Hopton attack. So what you want to do, you either want your bishop on d3 or on c4, you want your knight on c3, and your g1 knight you want on f4. Because it's getting really hard to play e5 and also really risky to play e5 with all the other pawns around your king having moved already. The idea here is to, well, continue attacking. The best move is h5. You could not play h5, you can play knight c3, you can play bishop c4, you can play bishop d3, you can play knight e2, knight f4, but the most principled move is h5. Just gaining space, controlling g6, giving your bishop the h4 square, and preparing, if you manage to get in knight f4, then you can get in knight g6 without losing your knight if there's a bishop on f7. So black continues bishop e6, you continue knight e2, he plays bishop f7, you continue knight f4. Now the pawn is defended twice. Knight c6 developing, bishop to b5, pinning the knight, a6, you can take, that's a perfectly viable option, but then at some point you'll have to play b3. So bishop a4, and now bishop g7, knight c3, finishing development, e6, consolidating in the center, and here's the point. In the Hopton attack, you're not better as white. If you play the most precise moves and black plays the most precise moves, probably black is going to be equal, but it's going to be very hard to play black. So the idea is to play tricky lines, and I'm going to recommend knight g6. Now, knight g6, if that's taken, then the king will have no shelter throughout the game. It's going to be really hard to play black. You have the h4 square, you can continue with d5, break through the center, for example, queen d7, d5. And now after this happens, I mean, well, excuse me, the knight has to move first. Yeah, the knight, yeah, this is already over. So patterns like this, you just want to open up lines, castle, queenside, and checkmate. So if that's taken, black is going to be in trouble. So the principled move is rook h8, playing for bishop f8 or bishop h8 and trying to take twice. And after this rook has committed to g8, you simply go back to f4, and now black is not castling kingside. After queen d7, queen d3, b5, for example. Yeah, you can retreat to b3, but again, I would recommend knight takes b5, and after a b5, bishop b5, something like king e7 and queen c3, putting pressure on the knight. So stuff like this could happen very easily. So just remember this pattern of knight e2, knight f4, h4, h5, and knight g6. And that's going to lead to huge trouble for black in most h6 lines. And this applies to both e3 and bishop g3 on move 4. So h6 against the Hopton attack, I wouldn't play myself. It's the second most popular move, and it's fine for black, but it's very tricky. Now let's have a look at g6, the main line. So after bishop g5, g6, simply ignoring the bishop and saying, okay, I'm going to play a Leningrad, your bishop is weird on g5, and I'm fine. So you continue knight c3, controlling the center, trying to prevent an easy d5, which can be played. There are three moves for black here, which I would like to look at. One is a very rare sideline, knight h6. The idea is knight f7, simply chasing the bishop away. And if black plays knight h6, then you have to waste no time. You strike in the center with e4. Knight f7, the bishop drops back to e3, fe4, knight e4, d5, knight g5. And this, I think, is very pleasant for white. If this knight is traded off, your bishop is back on g5, If c5 ever happens, then you have bishop b5. If nothing happens, then you will take and play knight f3, knight e5. This square is now vacated, and with all the other pawn moves, I don't think there's good enough justification for knight h6. Again, it has been played by very strong players, so what do I know? Another sideline is d5. More pawn weaknesses, but taking a stand in the center, e3, bishop g7, and again, g6 or g5 have to be undermined. So in Leningrad setups with g6, f5, you again have this pattern of playing h4 straight away. c6, knight f3, knight f6, bishop to d3, looking at the f5 pawn, so when h5 happens, f5 could fall, of course not when the bishop is there. So bishop e6, knight to e2, again looking at f4, bishop coming back to f7, knight f4, knight b to d7, for example, and now h5. And this cannot be taken because you have a knight on f4, and it's not easy to find a good move. Again, I believe this is just much easier to play for white. So d5, I don't think is a good move. The best move and the most principled move, following A with B, if you play g6, then you play bishop g7. I think that's what black should play. And this is the position I would play if I faced the Hopton attack. Now again, white has a choice between three moves, e4, e3, and h4. We are going to be looking at e3. I would really recommend that as the safest, soundest move that still gives you great attacking chances. Let's just briefly have a look at e4 and h4. If e4, then black's best is to take knight e4 and continue with d5. This is a pattern when e4, fe4, knight e4, you play d5. The knight goes to c5, black plays b6, the knight goes back to b3, and now knight h6, knight f7 again. I'm not going to say this is bad for black, but I'm going to say that if black doesn't come up with something quickly, then this pawn structure is really dubious. So e4 is okay. On the other hand, e4 gives black a freer hand in the center, and you don't have as much central control. Your e4 square is weak. This bishop could be very handy. Black could even consider castling queenside, and it's not that you have a good kingside attack. If, for example, bishop d3 castles kingside, black doesn't have too many issues either. He's going to have an extremely easy time playing e5, and then this bishop is good on the diagonal. So e4, I prefer to keep my d4 pawn defended in the Hopton. That's just my opinion. The other option is h4, which I like more than e4, but I still don't think it's the best one. h6 played, should be played, and bishop f4. That simply prevents g5. Now knight f6, pawn to e3, pawn to d6, queen to f3, castles, and bishop to c4 check is considered to be slightly better for white after something like king h7. But again, an improved Jobava London system in a way against which black plays the Dutch defense. So if you continue h4, it's going to resemble the Jobava London system or the London system, depending on what you want to do. After something like knight h3, queen e8, trying to defend, there are already areas of knight g5 check, and if hg5, then hg5, and yeah, knight h5. I mean, it's tricky. You cannot take immediately because the queen defends, but there are already patterns like that. So h4, I would say, is the strongest attacking option for white. And now let's have a look at the principal move. Pawn to e3. Simple. Okay. Now, if you want to play this aggressively, after d5, you can again continue with h4, which is probably what I would play in most games. So remember, you're playing a Jobava London system against an attempt at a mix between the Stonewall and the Leningrad. So if you want to play it safe, play bishop d3, bishop d3 or knight f3. After something like knight f3, black plays c6, you play bishop d3, they play knight f6, you castle kingside, knight e4 happens, for example, bishop f4, and now you can see that this is the London system setup you are aiming for. So if you want to do that castle kingside and play without h4, this setup is simple, and white should hold an edge whatever happens, because this bishop is quite dubious. It's going to have to, black is going to have to waste time for b6, bishop a6. e5 is very hard to achieve with all of these pieces controlling e5. You have given up the e4 square, but you have to give up something. So this is pleasant for white. Again, if black does castle kingside, then you could still consider h4, h5. Why not? But if you want to play it aggressively, then h4 straight away. And whenever you play h4, black has to think twice before he castles kingside. So c6, bishop to d3, bishop to e6, and now black will want to do the same thing with bishop f7 if given time. Knight f3, knight to d7, h5, undermining everything, and now knight g to f6, and here, not many games from this position. In most games, bishop f6 has been played. You can also play h takes g6, but there's a great move I would recommend, and this is sort of the key position, in my opinion, for the main line of the Hopton, and this is very likely to appear on the board. You continue with h6, and after bishop f8, you go for the same nice maneuver of knight e2, knight f4. Sometimes there are even sacrifices possible on g6. So bishop f7, knight f4, and if this is not a great position, then I don't know what is. Which, I mean, I play the Dutch, and I keep changing my mind as to what I should play against it. I like the Staunton, now I like the Hopton, and this, I believe, is just a great position. Black jumps into e4, fine, you take it. F takes e4, knight e5, and don't be afraid of this. After something like queen d7, you can continue queen d4. Now you're already threatening e6, so black has to play e6, and there are too many weaknesses. Something like bishop f6, rook g8. This is just too much space, too much piece activity, and you can basically do whatever you want. You could even castle kingside here, give up this pawn, but you don't have to. You can continue king e2, and just try to play rook d1, c4, open up the center, and try to use the fact that black's king is going nowhere. If, for example, bishop e7 and, I don't know, rook d1, bishop takes, pawn takes, then any endgame is better for white. Okay, so if I'm playing white, I'm playing f3, trying to undermine the e4 pawn, and then I'm playing knight d3, knight e5. If for example, let's go for a dream scenario. So castles, here takes, and I don't know, king b8, knight d3, rook e8, knight e5, and I think this is resignable. So this variation will give you a lot of activity. e3 against the g6 line, and the early h4. Again, if you don't want to play for that, you can play for a sensible London system setup. So, sorry for being biased, but I only have words of praise for the Hopton Attack. I think it's a great opening. I think it's a great weapon against the Dutch. And if you're a Dutch player and you don't know it, you better learn it. If you are a d4 player and you're struggling against the Dutch, pick up the Hopton. It's a great weapon. Hope you like the video. Let me know what you think, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.